Hey guys, welcome back to Coffin Corner Podcast. I have again on the show editor-in-chief here at Met Media and fucking music nerd. James Burky. We're going to go over Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network just published an article of projections for, stat projections for the top defensive rookies this year. And we're just going to kind of go over this and kind of see what we think and compare them to other rookies from last year. First on the docket, Nick Bosa. And he has him obviously number 2 overall pick, I believe. Number 2 or 3. But he has him projected as 55 tackles and 10 sacks. San Francisco has taken a lot of defensive linemen the past couple of years that haven't worked out. But do you think that's fair to say for Nick Bosa?
I think I'm pulling up the roster right now. I think that's of a lot of these stats. I'm always iffy on these kinds of articles, but I think of all these stats that are being predicted, I think I could buy that one the most because teams are going to be really focusing a lot on DeForest Buckner. He had
12 sacks.
Yeah, he had 12 sacks a year ago. He was playing excellent. And Buckner lines up on the weak side of the line. He's a right end. He lines up against a right tackle. I could see it happening. I think that's going to be interesting to see. I have the 49ers season schedule here. I think he could get the bulk of his sacks within the division.
Yeah.
Because really the only real strong left tackle Bosa will be going up against will be Andrew Whitworth on the Rams, and Whitworth is 37.
Yeah.
And dude is he played well last year, but he's age is catching up to him.
Yeah, I think another guy too that I see on there, you have the Steelers, is Andrew Villanueva, or Alejandro Villanueva might be a challenge for him.
Yeah, he could be. Alejandro Villanueva, he's an interesting guy. He's a real big body, and he does a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think Mike Munchak turned him into a Pro Bowl.
Yeah, it was definitely Mike Munchak's doing. Just taking a brief look at everything that everyone that the 49ers have to go up against. I think it could happen.
Yeah.
Because again, I'm not really sold on any offensive line in the NFC West this year.
Yeah, definitely not.
The Rams really are in a transition period. The Rams have been the team that has had the best offensive line the last 2 seasons, but they also had the most experience, which in turn the oldest.
Yeah.
Now that all that age is catching up with them, they're in a transition period. So I think the door is open for a lot of havoc to be wreaked.
Yeah, well, and Seattle, doesn't have a great line either. Jermaine Ifedi, I think, is their right or left tackle. But, I think all the other weapons on this defensive line will open him up for a lot more sacks. Obviously, you said DeForest Buckner, them signing Quan Alexander to solidify the middle. And then you still have Solomon Thomas, who was a top 5 pick at an edge rusher last year. So, will he develop? We'll see. But I think, it's very reminiscent of Bradley Chubb last year. Obviously, he was 2 spots ahead of, Bosa and being picked. But, 65 tackles and 12 sacks, too shy of the record. But I think the ability and kind of the situation is very similar for them. You have a Pro Bowl sack leader. Chubb had Von Miller on the other side of him. Not to say that DeForest Buckner is as good as Von Miller, but you still have, complementary guys next to it. So 10 sacks, I think, for him is a good projection, but I think it'll be a little higher, and I think the tackles will be a little less.
I think the sacks could definitely come into play because, as you said, you get Quan Alexander, you get, and you still have Solomon Thomas. You have those guys on your front line.
Don't forget about Eric Armstead.
And Eric Armstead, that's a really built defensive line.
That's 4 top 10 picks.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good defensive line. And if it's not Bosa, I think 2 guys are going to contribute. I think 2 guys are going to contribute like 20 sacks total. Yeah. Could you turn my headphones? We were talking about the defensive line for the 49ers. It reminds me of It reminds me of like Fisher era Rams who had those 4 first-round picks on the front line.
Michael
Brockers, Chris Long.
Yeah.
all those guys. But I think these guys are at better stages in their careers to be developed.
Yeah.
So that, I'm really excited for this defensive line. I'm obviously not a 49ers fan.
Yeah,
but,
me either.
I think if Bosa doesn't get 10 sacks, someone will on that line.
Yeah, well, and again, I think his projection is pretty spot on with 10. That's a safe pick. But yeah, I think he'll be a double-digit sack leader.
Yeah.
The next person on this list, again, Daniel Jeremiah's NFL analyst article about projections for rookies. Quinnen Williams, third overall pick, right after Nick Bosa, and he has him going for 60 tackles and 6 sacks. For me, it's a little high for Quinnen Williams. I think that he is a very raw talent, obviously not having a lot of starting experience at Alabama. I mean, he became this star who everyone started paying attention to in his second year starting. So
Yeah.
I think he has a lot of developing to do. Stat-wise, I think he'll have a very similar it'll be right under this. I think he'll have a very similar season that Daron Payne had in Washington last year, having 56 tackles and 5 sacks.
Yeah.
But I think, when you talk New York, it's very similar to the 49ers in the fact that they just signed C.J. Mosley, and they have Leonard Williams to complement him. But I think as a defensive tackle, 6 sacks is kind of high for a rookie.
Yeah, and not just that, he's also a nose tackle.
Yeah, he's not.
They're running the 3-4, and I think definitely, as you said, Leonard Williams will command some blocking attention. And even though C.J. Mosley at inside is not so less on the sacks but more on the tackles, you want to keep an eye out. You want to get out once you get out to that second level. You want to make sure you've taken care of Mosley. So I think maybe Quinnen Williams could benefit from the fact that there are those 2 stout pieces around him. But yeah, I'm kind of with you there. 6 sacks for a nose tackle on a front line, on a defense or front 7 that frankly beyond C.J. Mosley and Leonard Williams doesn't have much.
Yeah.
Really, Quinnen Williams is kind of like the third big name guy there. So it's not something like we're in Bosa's case. It's like, okay, well, we can't focus all of our attention to these guys because then these guys are definitely going to ruin us. Like, nothing against the guys that the Jets have because, they're professional athletes. They can ruin games, but they're not as big of threats as Solomon Thomas or Eric Armstead or Quan Alexander. There's a big difference between Quan Alexander and Steve McLendon and Trayvon Sanders. I mean, there's a clear power gap there. So I think the tackles, I could be bought on the tackles. I'm not bought on the sacks, really.
Yeah, well, and exactly. He plugs the whole. I will disagree with you on the whole thing. Supporting cast wise, I definitely think the Jets have more playmakers than the 49ers because you got to think about Jamal Adams and Trumaine Johnson in the secondary, Marcus May even. And I think that will benefit the Jets a lot, in the run game.
But I don't know how much the secondary would. Okay, so yeah, I guess.
But again, he's playing nose tackle, so it's like
nose tackle. So
they'd have to be the best secondary in the NFL for him to rack up sacks.
Yeah, and which is why maybe because I do think True, played a lot of years with the Rams. He's a really reliable corner, and I love Jamal Adams. I do think that. If anyone on that front line is being benefited from that playmaking secondary, it's going to be guys like Leonard Williams.
Yeah, pass rushers.
Yeah. And Williams can develop into that, but for a first year, not so sure.
Well, and going back to my comparison, right, Daron Payne, also a nose tackle, obviously a different scheme defense, but he was also, playing next to Jonathan Allen, another first-round pick and a defensive tackle. So a little more versatile there because you have another guy playing in the middle with you.
Yeah.
But I think it'll be similar, 5 sacks, 56 tackles, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, and also looking at it, looking at the Jets' schedule real quick, a couple games that pop out at me. I could see them having a day against the Dolphins. They have 2 games against Dolphins. I could see maybe a couple sacks come from that, depending if, all these predictions of doom on the Dolphins do come to fruition, then you could get a couple sacks. I think you could get like 3 or 4 sacks, and 6 sacks I think is a possibility. I don't know if it's likely though.
Yeah.
Necessarily, but
Well, and a lot of people are comparing him to Warren Sapp in the play styles.
Mm-hmm.
But I just, I think he might be as good as Warren Sapp one day. But I think it's going to take a little bit more time for him. He's a young player, so I think it's going to take a little more time for him to get there.
And that's why, I love these articles, but I also have, I'm not too big on them because of, guys with, Devin White. Devin White, who is on here, don't mean to spoil it for our listeners, but guys like Devin White who are pro ready, and that's a guy kind of reminds me of Luke Kuechly, like a guy that you can go in and you're saying, hey, I think he gets 130 tackles, 110 tackles, yeah, okay, I could see that, but then because he's ready to go now.
Yeah,
Queenan Williams, he has a huge upside. Yeah. But he's not ready to go now. He's not going to go in and be an Aaron Donald and be a Warren Sapp.
Yeah. Well, and Aaron Donald wasn't even an Aaron Donald in his rookie year.
I mean, he still got 10 sacks.
Yeah, but compared to what he is now, it's insane. But we'll see. The next guy on here I have is Clelin Ferrell, 4th pick overall by the Raiders, and his projections were 6 sacks and 60 tackles, which are exactly what Quinnen Williams had. 65 tackles, sorry. So 5 more tackles, the same amount of sacks. I find this really interesting. I think, Clelin Ferrell, a lot of people say he was taken really high. The Raiders even said, we took him for his leadership ability, not necessarily his pass rush ability. While he is a talented player, he's supposed to be a mid-round pick. Yeah. I think, he'll have a very similar season to Sam Hubbard, the pass rusher for the Bengals out of Ohio State last year. Sam Hubbard obviously picked way later, but for his 6 sacks, 39 tackles, and I think in Oakland, again he was taken a little high, and in Oakland the supporting cast there on defense isn't very they're all new. Obviously they got the safety from St. Louis. Help me out here.
Oh, Joyner.
And they drafted Jonathan Abrams, so you solidify your secondary. But, they got Brandon Marshall from Denver and Vontaze Burfict playing in the middle. So I just don't know how much the cohesiveness will be there.
Yeah.
And, who else is on that defensive line?
Yeah,
not much. So I think, he predicted it fairly close. I don't think he's going to have double-digit sacks. And I think he'll have less tackles as well.
Yeah, I think the sacks is pretty good because last year the Raiders had a total of 11 sacks, I believe, as a team. Mm-hmm. Their highest, their sack leader was, I think, Maurice Hurst, I think
it was Mo Hurst or Arden Key.
It was Mo Hurst had 4. Arden Key had 3. Mm-hmm. So 6 sacks. I think it was such a bad season that you have nowhere to go but up.
Yeah.
And another thing, less entirely focused on Ferrell, but still relating a lot to Ferrell. This is really the first year of John Gruden.
Yeah.
He's now getting his guys in, so I think now it's the time to really start judging him. And I think 6 sacks seems good. It seems like a good projection. But then even looking at the defense, the guys that you were throwing out there, someone's gonna reach double-digit sacks. Yeah. And Ferrell, he may not be that guy, but he'll be 2 or 3, and he'll be he'll be part of some solid improvement. And if his leadership ability is as good as it says, that can translate mentally. Maybe he gets to 7 sacks. But this was one where I felt a little bit safer on. I'm can definitely.
Well,
see
and it's
that.
It's always easier to pick the lower number because guys are more likely to have the lower number. But I agree with you. I think it's an extremely young defensive line. If you look at the starters, Jonathan Hankins obviously has been in the NFL for a very long time.
Yeah.
But Mo Hurst and Arden Key were rookies last year, and not first-round picks either. So I think it'll be hard for him. The biggest question for me is the inside, right? The inside of that. Brandon Marshall and Vontaze Burfict. A lot of times guys have been Pro Bowlers in their career and they get signed because of that, or just because they've been productive in the past. And I just don't know how effective Brandon Marshall and Vontaze Burfict are going to be in the middle of that.
Definitely,
that
but
front seven.
I think you also did make a really good point that Mo Hurst and Arden Key were rookies. Mm-hmm. And, one of the beauties about bad teams is that the guys who otherwise wouldn't get a chance to shine get the chance to shine, and they get the chance to show what they can do. So, being on a bad team and still getting a handful of sacks, I wouldn't necessarily say that both Hurst and Key are going to continue to develop and be real quality and serviceable guys. Just because, like, thinking statistically back on how often that happens, it seems likely one of those two guys is going to fall off. But I mean, you're still probably going to get one contributor out of that group, and for a late round pick.
Well, and both those guys, Mo Hurst and Arden Key, I've said before, obviously last year covering the draft, like, I feel like they will be productive NFL players. Maurice Hurst and Arden Key were both projected to go higher than they did. So I agree with you. And honestly, I think that maybe not this year, but in a few years, that could be a really solid defensive line.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next guy. And this one might be our longest talking point because we both love this guy. But 5th overall pick to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Devin White, linebacker at LSU. In this article, he's projected 130 tackles and 2 interceptions. I totally believe it. I think he can be Darius Leonard-like in his rookie year. Leonard having 111 tackles, 7 sacks. I don't know how many picks he had, but I think Devin White is going to be the most pro-ready player in this draft, aside from T.J. Hawkinson.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Go
I mean, I kind of drew the comparison earlier. He reminds me a lot of Luke Kuechly, not in skill set, but just in how ready they are to go.
Yeah, production-wise.
Production-wise and impact-wise. I'm not necessarily knocking that at all, and I'm looking at the Bucs defensive lineup right now. I mean, on the front line, you have a lot of guys. You have a lot of questionable guys. You do have Sue. You do have Vitavea.
I mean, Pierre-Paul made the Pro Bowl last year as a pass rusher.
Yeah, but I think Pierre-Paul also...
I think that was like an anomaly of a season.
Yeah, but he also just had that injury.
Yeah, another injury.
That neck injury. And then there's some... And then, I mean, you have Levante David. You have Kevin Minter. You have some real decent guys on there that...
Even Shaq Barrett was a good signing.
I think you have enough guys on there to where he can really stand out.
Yeah, and he has the ability to make plays.
Yeah, he already has that ability to make plays, and it's harder for real talented guys on not so talented teams to flash out, and really show the world what they can do. I think that the Bucs defense is decent enough to keep them in games, and that White can be a playmaker. The 130 tackles is I wouldn't be surprised.
That's a stretch for me because that's a lot for anyone.
It's a lot for anyone, and I love buying into guys' hype as much as the next person. But 100, I'd say like 100 tackles to be safe.
100 plus is what I'm saying. A little over 100 is what I think. To me, he's very reminiscent of a player like Al Wilson, who just big physical linebacker, who gets a tackle every other play. So and I love the Luke Kuechly comparison. I loved Luke Kuechly coming out of Boston College, but I think he's so pro ready, and I don't think this defense is terrible. Obviously, Ndamukong Suh is a starting defensive tackle on any NFL team for the most part, and then you have Levante David, who he can play next to. The secondary, there's a lot of questions. I'm pretty sure their best player is Vernon Hargraves, who's not very good. So that'll be hard to deal with. But I do think he becomes the leader of this defense. And solidifies himself as a perennial Pro Bowler right off the bat.
Yeah, and I think also a guy who I'd mentioned before we started recording, I think him and Deion Buchanan could really complement each other because they're both those tweeners. Like White used to play, if I remember correctly, I think he tried to play some safety. Maybe that was in high school, can't remember. Anyway, but I think he's a former running back, so he has that speed. He has that real agile ability, elusiveness, which it's going to be interesting to see how that translates. Because on the other side of the coin, he has never gone up against offensive linemen and tight ends as big as the guys are here in the NFL. So on the opposite side of the coin, he could be pushed around a bit. And also looking at their schedule, it could really turn out to be well for them. I think this is definitely, of all these picks, the most intriguing one because
it's a weird situation for him.
Yeah, it is a weird situation, but I think the He could be to even draw another comparison, he could be like another Derek Brooks who comes in with an iffy situation but really starts developing nicely.
Yeah. Well, and Derek Brooks had the benefit of having, John Lynch on that team. And whoever else was, I can't name them all off the top of my head, but that was a good defense.
Yeah.
I don't think that he's coming into anything like that, pending Vita Vea being a Pro Bowler next year. But I think because he's on a not very good team, you have this weird transition. Can Bruce Arians fix Jameis Winston and Peyton Barber as your running back, but you still have Mike Evans, and you have a good tight ends.
Yeah.
But I think that he's more than likely the Buccaneers will be a bad team.
Yeah.
And more than likely they won't make the playoffs. But I think he'll be that guy where it's clearly the best player on a bad team.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I think that'll help him shine in his rookie year. But yeah, definitely over 100 tackles, and I'd say 2 to 3 picks. The next guy on this list I'm not really high on. He was people say he plays similar to Von Miller, but I just don't think he should have been a first-round draft pick. Brian Burns, the 16th pick out of Florida State to the Panthers. Obviously, they need a lot of help on the edge, having who they have on that defensive line. And I compare him to another late-round pick from last year, Marcus Davenport, who, a lot of talent coming out of UTSA. And when he went to the Saints, obviously they have Cam Jordan and Sheldon Rankins on the defensive line, but wasn't very productive for a mid-round pick. He had 4.5 sacks and 12 tackles, obviously barring injury. But I think Brian Burns will do something similar to that. He has him on here as 40 tackles, 6.5 sacks. I don't think he gets past 6. Obviously, playing stand-up linebacker in that defense, he'll have the chance to edge rush a lot. But I think somewhere around 30 tackles and 6 sacks is what I would slate for Brian Burns.
Yeah, I think that seems about fair. I mean, the Panthers, he's defensive end, right? Yeah.
D end, outside linebacker.
On the edge, so he's just an edge guy.
Yeah.
I don't know. Brian Burns is one of the more kind of enigmas from the draft because, and especially,
I feel like he's a system guy.
Yeah, he's a system guy, and especially the Davenport comparison is good because Davenport showed his flashes, but he just couldn't keep it going. He could never really make any headroom, I guess, on that team. And, looking at who the Panthers have, they have an aging but still decent Mario Addison.
Yeah.
And he could easily break through for maybe 4 or 5 sacks, but I agree that 6 sacks seems a bit much. It depends if the Panthers' defense is back or not.
Yeah, well, if their defensive tackles do as well as they can. I mean, Dontari Poe and K'Wan Short are above average defensive tackles if you look at most defensive tackles in the league. But I think Brian Burns is a developmental guy. I think he's one of those guys who 5 years from now might go to the Pro Bowl.
Yeah.
But I just don't see him making an immediate impact. And so if he got 6 sacks, I think he'd be, above what I ever thought he would do.
Yeah, and especially, against playmakers like Dontari Poe. He's going with. Poe's aging, but Gerald McCoy, those guys.
Yeah. And they got Gerald McCoy too. So that's. And that. At
the least, he could get some. I think he could get a lot of pressures that push the quarterback into McCoy, into Addison, into those guys, or he could benefit from pressures made by the other guys. And he gets sacks, but just a guy who's in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, well, and I think adding Gerald McCoy kind of mixes up their whole entire rotation of who's pass rushing, and I think that will, I think it's not going to be him every snap, you know what I mean? And I think that'll take away from, his playing time.
Definitely.
So let's move on. First secondary guy. Jonathan Abram, what pick was he? I don't even remember. 27th pick. He was the Raiders' 3rd first-round pick. Safety out of Mississippi State. They have him slated for 100 tackles and 2 interceptions. For me, that's a lot.
Yeah.
For a late-round safety. Although, he was projected to go anywhere from 14 to 17 or 20 or something. And he did fall a little bit. But just...
it depends where... I think it depends where they're going to play. And the biggest time what I see most or most likely for safeties to reach that number of tackles is in that strong spot. So, they'll be put in the box at times. And you already have a guy like that with LaMarcus Joyner.
Yeah.
And that's how Joyner was always used with the Rams. Once he made that transition from nickel corner to strong safety, he flourished relatively. Obviously not enough for us to keep him, but with Joyner there and Abrams, someone's going to be cutting into someone else's play time.
Yeah,
and I don't even a guy like Abrams. I think he has a lot of potential. I'm interested to see what he does, but.
I mean, for me, with Devin White, it was so easy to say, like, well, he plays in the middle, and he was a huge, super high draft pick as an inside linebacker. Yeah, he's going to have over 100 tackles. A late round safety, 100 tackles for a safety is a lot to begin with. I'm going to compare his season, and this, again, is I think this player is a little better than him, is Jesse Bates. From Cincinnati. He had 3 interceptions as a rookie, 73 tackles. I think, that is comparable. I think over 100 is just crazy to say, honestly. But I think, in the range of 2 interceptions and, 60 tackles would be right there for Jonathan Abram.
I would agree with that.
So, and you got to think, too, he hasn't won. Obviously, Carl Joseph is a bust. We know, the safety from West Virginia that they have, but he still has to beat him out for the job.
Yeah,
too.
he still has to beat out Joseph, and even though Joseph is not playing well, I mean, Joseph is still
a former first-round pick.
He's a former first-round pick. The window is closing on him. It's not shut yet. And granted though, this is Del Rio's guy versus Gruden's guy, and Gruden is in charge, so Gruden's guys might have a better chance in the long run. I agree. It's tough to see that come out right away. Granted, I mean, if he does win the starting spot and the front 7 isn't fantastic, then he is going to have a lot of tackling opportunities.
Which very much well could happen because we go back to the Cleveland Farrell conversation. How much faith do you have in Brandon Marshall and Vontaze Burfict being productive?
Yeah.
So I mean, there are certain situations where he could have a shit ton of tackles. Even then, I still don't think it's over 100.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So, all right, well, let's move on. Last guy on this list, DeAndre Baker. I think he was a second-round pick, I believe. Or
he was 30th.
30th, okay, close enough. 30th pick to the Giants, cornerback from Georgia. I really like this guy a lot. I think they nailed his stats. They have him predicted 55 tackles and 2 interceptions. And, he's a really tall cornerback, lanky, fast guy. But I think he'll struggle a little bit just because I think most corners, unless your name is Jalen Ramsey, your rookie year, you get burnt and you get what's the word I'm looking for? Exposed.
Yeah.
He's going to be, playing against high caliber receivers. Not that he didn't in the SEC.
But he didn't play against Amari Cooper.
Or
he didn't
Julio
play
Jones or
he
Odell
didn't play
Beckham.
Any of those guys. Yeah. So I agree. I entirely agree with that. It's he's also going to be, to a degree, he might be tested a lot because, I don't know how much he's going to be tested because Janoris Jenkins is one of the biggest. He could be so much better cornerbacks. He has so much potential, but has just never realized it. And Jenkins is a real feast or famine type guy. Either he goes for that pick and he gets that flashy interception or turnover, or he gets burned.
Yeah.
And so on one end, he may get, if Jenkins is having a day, then Baker's going to start seeing a lot of more stuff thrown his way, because when Jenkins gets hot, you don't want to really test him when he gets too hot. But then if he does, kind of usual Jenkins and starts getting burned, then Baker isn't going to see as much, stuff thrown his way, because they're going to be like, all right, let's just really pick at this wound and really expose the scab of Janoris Jenkins.
Yeah. Well, and I think, too, it's dependent on, Sam Beal, who starts. Does DeAndre Baker start? But a guy I would compare him to, their play styles are completely different, but I think the production will be very similar, is Justin Reed from Houston, who's a late-round guy, but he had 88 tackles and 3 interceptions. I think if DeAndre Baker gets the chance to start, he could have somewhere close to that. I think they have it pretty close. I think he might, 2 interceptions is spot on.
Yeah.
Again,
agree.
pending if he starts. But I think for years to come, DeAndre Baker will be the guy that, has a bunch of tackles for a cornerback.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, in the NFC East, they're not going to be, this is all speculative, but I wouldn't be surprised if all the defenses in that division are having to run 3 corner sets because, I mean, now you have Carson Wentz coming back, and they always say that the second year back from the knee injury is when you're really back.
Yeah, and they added Deshaun Jackson.
So you have Deshaun Jackson back, you have Alshon Jeffrey, you have Zach Ertz.
You added Jordan Howard.
You have Jordan Howard, you have Dallas Goedert. You're going to need to be putting in a lot of corners to cover them, and then against the Cowboys. I mean, you have a lot of real great receivers there. You have Gallup and Cooper, namely, and then you have a lot of other talent there. And then with Washington, Washington's Washington.
Yeah.
But, if Dwayne Haskins really, I'm sold on, not sold, but I like Haskins.
Yeah, well, and they got Darius Geis back from injury.
Yeah.
You still have Jordan Reed.
Yeah, so you may need to put in those guys who, those slimmer and real more agile guys to kind of match up against those receivers and running backs that are coming out, because you can't put a linebacker on Darius Geis.
Yeah, or, you can't put a linebacker on Ezekiel Elliott either, who's a good pass catcher out of the backfield.
Yeah.
We'll see. I think, out of all this whole list, I think Devin White is the most probable to reach these projections. But, this time next year, this list will be 100 different people.
Yeah.
Because, projecting stats, that's why I love to do these, talk about these articles, is because, it's just based on nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's all based on sole opinion. So it's fun to kind of break it down. And go over it. But we'll see. Hopefully our boy Devin White has a good year. We both love it. It's like him and TJ Hawkinson.
Yeah.
I just am in love with those two.
Yeah.
But that's all we have for today.
All right.
Thank you, James Burky.
Thank you for having me.
For coming on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at Coffin Corner Met and on Facebook at Coffin Corner Podcast, and now on YouTube at Coffin Corner Podcast. And you can find all of our sports content here at Met Media on mymetmedia.com. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you.
All right,
have a great day.
Yep.